Hey everyone, Mario again, coming at you with another literature review. As you can tell from up there, it's another Dark Tower review. This time it is the second entry in the series, The Drawing of the Three. The book is about 400 pages and it was published by Grant in May of 1987. Now, as King puts it himself in the afterword of this book, the success of the original novel and the clamoring for it, because it was originally published in limited quantities, people saw the name in one of the other books and like, Dark Tower, the Gunslinger, I've never heard of that King book. So they wrote in, wanted to inquire about it, and it was published in a mass market paperback. Sold well, so King's like, the story's been calling to me for a while, so might as well get around to writing the sequel, and here it is. And from there, it went on. Now, when this one was published, he already had the next two in mind loosely, because he has the names already written here. The next two, of course, are the Wastelands, and then Wizard in Glass. And this is what he says about them. But the Wastelands details half of the quest of Roland, Eddie, and Susanna to reach the tower, and the fourth tells it of enchantment and a seduction, but mostly of those things which befell Roland before his readers first met him upon the trail of the Man in Black. Since, for the review of the first one, I read the expanded edition, I go back and read this one, I noticed that there's still a couple minor inconsistencies between them, mainly because since this is from the original printing, it still had the original version of the Gunslinger in mind. It's mainly stuff when he's reminiscing about Martin and all that, just a couple things. It's like, alright, King probably later back should have gone back and edited that. It's just a minor thing. I'd say that it is a more complete work than the first one, only if you're comparing it to the original version. If you're comparing it to the expanded version, the revised version I think is written better, and I like the story a little bit more. With that said, this is a close second in that, because it gives it a good run for its money, mostly because of the interactions between Roland, Eddie, and Odetta/Detta. For those of you who don't know the story, you'll know in a moment. Now, the story picks up right where the first book leaves off. Roland is now on the Western Sea. He wakes up, his guns and bullets are soaked, so he's starting to go up the creek, and it's made worse when he's attacked by something that he dubs the lobstrosities. They're these weird creatures that come out of the sea that look like lobsters, but they're not lobsters. What one of them does is it takes these two fingers from Roland's right hand. And he is right-handed. So you can imagine what type of peril this puts him in. Because as he puts it himself, and with the guns, both hands were equal, but in everything else, righty ruled. And it's not just two fingers, it's his two top fingers. I mean, if he had lost these two, he could probably make do, because, it's these two. But think about it. It's like this. You have to try to do stuff like that, and there's a lot of stuff that's going to be difficult. Now, if he had lost the middle two, he could probably make do, but top two, no. As he puts it, I see serious problems ahead. Now, Roland staggers down the beach, and eventually he finds a door, and that's where he finds Eddie. Further down the beach, they come across another door where they meet Odetta, and with her they discover that she is a schizophrenic. Now, at the time that this book was written, I don't know if this is what the public or in medical journals thought schizophrenia was, but it doesn't really jive with what I know about schizophrenia, but who knows, maybe it was a more broad term when the book was originally written. Now it seems more like she'd be put under the diagnosis of multiple personality disorder, but that's just from what loosely I know. Then the third one is Jack Mort, which I'm going to go back around and talk about that. Now, Eddie is a heroin addict, so it ties back to the prophecy that the Oracle made in the first one. Now, when Roland goes to draw him, he is smuggling in cocaine. So you can imagine the complications that arise from this. I'm not going to go into every detail, but Roland's little intrusion into Eddie's mind causes the flight attendants to realize that the guy is smuggling, which means Roland has to help him, and he eventually does get the better of the federal agents who are there to prevent drugs from being smuggled in. But at the same time, it also makes a little bit of a complication with a man called Il Rocca, Enrico Balazar, the drug guy. He's kind of a kingpin of the mob. And you can imagine when a big-time mobster does not get the drugs that he bought the way that he wanted them to, he's going to be mad. And of course, this leads to a shootout in his apartment where Eddie actually has to do the shooting naked, which is the subject of one of the pieces of art done by Phil Hale. Let me find it real quick. Oh, there it is. Right there, he had to do the shootout butt naked, which actually gains him some of Roland's respect, because he's like, it's not easy to do a shootout when you're suffering from withdrawal, but to do it naked, ooh. And even though the shells were wet, they do have some good ones, and they managed to make do. And it's actually a very well-written scene, especially some of the humor that King throws in about automatic weapons. It's something that might not translate that well if it was actually filmed, but if you angled it right, it might. I told him not to keep pushing the trigger! You'd have to add in a word like that. Now, once they get back into Roland's world, obviously they go down and meet Odetta/Detta. They have to deal with her multiple personality disorder, because she's Detta on the other side, which is the violent part of her. And as Eddie notices later on, she seems to be kind of a stereotype caricature of a black lady, because she's black. And she is drawn from the 60s, just as Eddie is drawn from the 80s. Late 80s, which doesn't really come into play at all until the next one, when Eddie reminisces about RoboCop. Which, I'll get to why he reminisces about it later, but with Detta, her time period kind of plays into the whole caricature thing, because she really does talk like a caricature, like honky muffas. You kind of read what she's trying to say between the lines. And other things, if you listen to the audiobook, you really get the picture a lot more, because the guy who reads the audiobook really does bring the Detta part of her to life pretty well. And it complements the Odetta side of her, because Odetta is all nice and sweet and proper, befitting the daughter of a man who made his own wealth in the world and wanted the best for his daughter. Whereas Detta, whoa, if you were to hear what she'd have to say, you'd probably be saying, you kiss your mother with that mouth? You're lucky your mother's not alive. She'd wash your mouth out with soap, Detta Walker. And part of Roland and Eddie's goal, as the story goes along, is to try to figure out a way to balance them. This is more so Roland's concern. Eddie is more so trying to figure out how he's going to deal with it, because as the story's going, he's falling in love with Odetta. And it slowly seems like she's falling in love with him, but it's kind of hard to tell, except for one little scene after they do the act. But Roland really wants to figure out a way to fuse them near the end. Mainly he wants Odetta's personality to be the dominant one, but throw in a little Detta to make her a little bit stronger. Make her will a little bit more ironclad, as it were. Now, behind the third door is Jack Mort, who we find out in a little piece of poetic irony, probably designed by the Man in Black, or at least that's what Roland thinks, is Jack Mort the Pusher. Now, there's two things about it. One, he is the one who pushed Jake into the street. And when Roland realizes this, because he sees Jake in front of him, he's like, oh no, is the door putting me into the body of the man that killed Jake right when he does it? But then he realizes, no, it's not here. And the actions that he does in Jack's body throughout the rest of the story create a time paradox, which will come into play in the next book, but I'm getting ahead of myself there. Now, here it's like a couple days, couple weeks. It's kind of hard to tell, and it's not really of any importance other than the paradox that it's going to create. The other little bit of importance that Roland realizes that Jack played in the story thus far is that he's the one that's responsible for Odetta being in a wheelchair, because that's one thing I haven't mentioned. She is not only a rich black lady living in the 60s, she's a rich black lady living in the 60s with no legs. Because apparently, Jack pushed her in front of a train, just like how he pushed Jake in front of a car. And the train cut her legs off. But to add to this, Jack is also responsible for the creation of Detta Walker, because he dropped a brick on her. Now, Roland, when he notices this, he's like, this is a coincidence too great to just be a coincidence. This is Ka at work. Ka is basically Roland's word for fate, destiny, whatever other word you want to plug in for it. And with all these things in line, it's not a coincidence. To simplify it, it's the tower at work, or whatever force owns the tower, or created the tower. It's all putting all these stones in one place, and now Roland has to cast them. Now, like the other two, he takes over Jack, but unlike Eddie and Odetta, he doesn't like go gently or just like do briefly. He takes full control of Jack, and Jack's mind is all panicking. And with Jack, he has to get ammo for the guns, and of course he has to get medicine for himself, because getting your fingers cut off in the way that he did, it's gonna lead to infection. I'm just simplifying it because up until this point, that's a major thing in Roland's story, is that he has to deal with the infection as they're going from door to door. And between Eddie's door and Odetta's door, they managed to tame it a little bit, but by the time they reach Jack's door, it's come back with a vengeance. Because it was basically like they punched it in the face, it went off a little bit to think, and then came back and like, I'm back! Hello, Roland, old buddy, old pal! And in the end, you can kind of guess, since there's more books, everything turns out right for the characters. I'm not going to give any major spoilers about it, but the ending of the book is very tense, mainly because of Detta Walker and those lobstrosities, and a little bit with Roland's predicament on Jack Mort's side, mainly with him having to deal with the public in the world of New York. And doesn't really give a year, other than it's a couple years after the moment that Jack pushed Odetta in front of the train. So I'd say probably late 50s, early 60s-ish. So you can imagine the type of people he has to deal with. Especially with the cops, because he has to deal with a couple cops in there. And one of them almost kills him. That's all I'm going to say about that. But it's a very tense scene. I can imagine if they had ever actually filmed that scene, how tense you could make it if you got the right lenses and the right angles. I know I'm thinking a lot about how you could film certain scenes in there, but that's just my cinematic mind going at work. Now, like I said earlier, this is a great follow-up to the first one. Definitely written better than the original printing of the first one. About on par with the revised one, but I think I might like the revised one a little bit more. But the character interactions in this one do make it a close second. Now, if you're going based on the original release of the first one, this is where the story starts to gain its footing a little bit more. I mean, most of the main action does not take place in Roland's world, except for a couple of the parts, because like how the first one is broken up into 5 sections, mainly because they were originally written as self-contained short stories that were part of a larger story, this one, originally written as a novel, is split up differently. We have the argument in the beginning, you know, king setting the story. We have a prologue, which is where Roland loses his fingers. Then we got 3 main sections, which contain the 3 different door actions. We got the prisoner, Eddie's story, Lady of the Shadows, the whole thing involving Odetta and Detta, and the pusher, the whole adventure with Jack Mort. And then in between the prisoner and the Lady of the Shadows, we have one called Shuffle, which is the journey from door to door. Then we got one called Reshuffle in between Lady and Pusher, and then the last one is Final Shuffle. Now, the first 2 shuffles have every now and then a break where it's like shuffle, and most of it is a break in time, mainly supposed to be in Roland's memory because of his delirium from the illness. And it's a creative way to denote the passage of time on King's part. Now, as I was saying, this is where the story really picks up steam, because you can see that King is a little bit more confident with the world he's creating, and you get a better sense of this world that it's vaguely like our own, but not fully. This is mostly told through Roland's recollections, mainly when he encounters things like he sees letters he recognizes, his interpretations of words that are common for us, like aspirin he calls Aston, photographs, photographs, just other little funny things like that. And of course his reaction to things he does recognize, like, huh. It's just mainly his reactions to things that we take for granted here that were either rare in his world or just didn't exist, like airplanes and stuff. His reactions are what make it work, which is why if they did a straight adaptation of the novels instead of the sequel/adaptation they are doing, just seeing all the fish out of water humor you could get with it would have been amazing. Who knows, maybe one day down the line, a couple decades, they can do a straight adaptation of it. But while this is where it really begins to pick up steam, it is the next book where King really has found his footing in this world, and The Dark Tower becomes a modern literary classic. And it is also where the stakes start to get raised for Roland and his company.